All right, in section 4 of chapter 9 here, we're going to talk about muscular responses when we're sending a nervous signal to the muscle and how it actually uh, works. And so we can actually observe this phenomenon if we take a muscle and hook it up to a device and create what we call a myogram. But first, in order for that to happen, um, we need to take the muscle and typically a muscle at rest is minus 100 millivolts. So yeah, we actually have electricity flowing throughout our body, and our nerve signal, when it sends a message to the muscle, we need to get that muscle to a minus 70 millivolt situation. So in fact, what we need then is we need to get 30 millivolts of stimulation to our muscles. And you may be experienced certainly more of this if you've ever experienced a shock or you grabbed onto an electrical fence, maybe on a farm, or even last year or the last couple of years if you were zapped by the Van de Graaff's machine, and we'll get that out, talk about that. So, but we need to have a positive 30 millivolts of stimulation required. Otherwise, we don't get a muscle contraction. And so we kind of have a all or none type response to the situation. If we don't get the 30 millivolts, nothing's going to happen, no muscle contraction. If we do get the 30 millivolts, then the muscle is going to contract. Excuse me. So then we can actually see that if we've hooked a muscle up to a machine and record the muscle contraction in what we call a myogram. And so we take and we can look at a single muscle twitch or a single muscle contraction that really lasts just a fraction of a second, and then we have that relaxation. So there's actually a delay in this process. We'll talk about that. And then we have our muscle contraction, and then there's a little bit of a refractory type period. Okay, so as we go through a muscle twitch, you can see on the graph here an actual muscle twitch. The muscle, we're recording the muscle contracting. So first, we have the latent period, and you can see that down here. Actually, right at this spot right here is when the muscle receives information from the nerve. So that acetylcholine is diffusing across and generating a new electrical signal. Electrical signal has to travel all throughout the sarcolemma, down the transverse tubules, and then the cisternae and sarcoplasmic reticulum need to release the calcium. So there's actually this latent period, a little period of time here where nothing happens. So all of that process can take place, and it's a very small fraction of a time. And so if we've reached our potential and got that 30 millivolts, our muscle starts to contract, and we get some force out of that contraction depending on what type of muscle it is, how many motor units have fired, things like that. And so we can see how much of a force that particular muscle is actually generated. And then take that stimulus away, and we have this period of relaxation where all the calcium gets reabsorbed by the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the cisternae, because the acetylcholinesterase has broken down the acetylcholine. Now there's no more electrical signal being sent through the sarcolemma, so the calcium goes back into the cisternae, so the muscle can now, in effect, relax. And we get to this point down here and it's fully relaxed. Well, before we can actually have another muscle contraction, we do have a refractory period. And that's not really shown on this graph all that well, but there's a small period of time when the muscle actually depolarizes too far and then has to come back to its resting potential. And so that has to do with, while it's relaxing, the movement of our sodium and potassium ions to reestablish our resting potential for our muscle to have a contraction. And so in order for that to happen, we need to reach a threshold, which we'll talk about. We need to reach that 30 millivolts of electrical signal, or are not going to have a contraction. So either we will have a contraction or we will not. And so some of that has to do with, are we reaching what we call a threshold? And so that threshold we have to reach in order to have a muscle contraction is that minus 70 millivolts. If we don't get to minus 70, nothing's going to happen. And so the strength of that contraction can increase depending on several different situations. So we could take a look at this in another situation here and showing the length of your muscle and your ability to generate a force. Okay, and we'll talk about this maybe in class, demonstrate it a little bit. But if your muscle is overly shortened, okay, so right here, and so we're looking at somewhere in here is about the 100% normal muscle length, and here for some reason your muscle has been shortened. Maybe it's already partially contracted, whatever the case may be. You can't generate very much force. On the other end of that spectrum, let's say your muscle is overly stretched. So let's say we're up here about 120% of our muscle length. So you've pulled a muscle. It's stretched out beyond where it normally is. Well, now when you try to have a muscle contraction, again, you can't generate a whole lot of force. You don't generate a powerful contraction for the muscle to do some work. So there is a range in which our muscles can actually have their contraction where they're most efficient. And I got a little demonstration that we'll show in class for that, but this kind of shows that situation. We got another slide type here. Here you can see we're hooked up to a type of myogram. Here we're going to measure force actually. So we got the muscle fiber right here hooked up to this machine. You can see several 3 sarcomeres lined up. We have a voltage meter right up here that's going to zap it with some electricity. And then we have a little device here that either creates more tension, stretches it too far or not far enough. So let's just take it. We're at a fairly optimal length here, and we'll zap it with a little bit of electricity, and we're going to record the force that the length of this muscle can generate, and we'll mark it on the graph over here to the right. And so we did that. So now let's change the length of the muscle. Let's stretch it out just a little bit. Okay, so we'll see if we're in that optimum range. We're going to zap it with electricity, and we're going to record the force that muscle can generate. Now, why are we zapping it with electricity? Well, this muscle isn't hooked up to a nerve right now, so we don't have a nerve sending that voltage signal to the muscle to have the contraction. So we've stretched it. Look what happened to our force here on the dot to the right. It decreased. Okay. And so now we're going to stretch the muscle even more. So 160. So this would be like when you pull a muscle, pull a hamstring, pull a bicep muscle. Let's zap it with electricity, see what kind of force it generates. Almost no force, you can see. So let's mark that on our graph. And you can see when you've pulled a muscle, you can't do much. You can't run fast. You can't have any sort of powerful movement. So let's change our length back. Now we'll go a little bit under 100% of normal length. So it's not fully stretched out, but that's okay. We'll zap it with an electrical signal. Our neuron, our fake neuron sends the message. We can see our force that's generated. Pretty good percentage of force that we're generated. We're at an optimal length again. Well, let's shorten the muscle. We're either partially contracted or something's already caused that muscle to be fatigued in some way. We're going to zap it with our electricity again, generate that force. Our force decreased a little bit. We'll mark that on our graph. And then we'll change the length one last time. Now it's really short. Zap it with electricity again. Record the force that's generated, and so you can see it's even less. So again, if we kind of fit our little curve here, if our muscle is at the optimum length, we can generate a lot of force. If our muscle is overstretched, pull the muscle, or even slightly contracted, that's on the left side of the graph, we can't generate very much force with all that. So the length of your muscle plays a vital role in each of these sorts of steps here. So what goes on if we continue getting individual signals being sent? Just one situation, we have a muscle twitch. That's one contraction. So you can see latent period, we have our muscle contraction, we have our relaxation, and it doesn't even show the refractory period very well. But here you can see muscle contraction, muscle contraction, muscle contraction, muscle contraction, and in between each one, the muscle's relaxing. So maybe that's contracting your bicep brachii muscle, individual twitches. Well, we can get those to combine if we're going to send a series of contractions, send a series of signals. And so here we're going to start it. We get a muscle contraction. It starts to relax, but we send another signal right away. So it's going to contract. It starts to relax. We send another signal right, and it even contracts more forcefully. So this is a situation maybe we're going to recruit more muscles. So maybe you're using a 5-pound dumbbell and you're doing bicep curls, and then as you get fatigued, you got to recruit more muscle fibers, more motor units to get that contraction. So, or maybe you want to hold that contraction, and so we get a sustained contraction. And so that's what we got on the bottom one here, is just a sustained contraction. We've recruited as many muscle fibers as we can. It's contracting, and it stays contracted in sort of what we'll say is sort of a tectonic state. So how do we recruit more muscle units? Well, just basically that term recruitment means we're going to increase the number or how many motor units are being activated. If you're, say, in the weight room and you're doing some bicep curls and you got a 5-pound dumbbell and you're going to do a set of 10 and you curl those and you set them down. And then you say, oh, that wasn't hard enough. Now I'm going to go grab a set of 10-pound dumbbells. You know, you do your set of 10. Well, as you've challenged yourself, you're recruiting more motor units to use that same amount or that increased amount of weight. So the whole muscle is composed of all kinds of motor units. Very, very rarely do we require or activate all of our motor units within a whole muscle, say your bicep brachii or your pectoralis major or whatever. Very seldom do we actually recruit all those motor units. Now let's say we need to have more of a precise movement. Okay, more precise movements are produced with fewer muscle fibers within a motor unit. So that might be one motor neuron hooking up to, I'm losing my signal here, one motor unit hooked up to, say, 5 muscle fibers. And so we can have very precise articulate control of things, like, say, an example of a surgeon doing brain surgery and cutting out cancer, like we saw in a video last year. As the intensity might increase, the stimulus increases, we're going to recruit more muscle units, and so more of them will be activated. Like if we want to generate a bigger force or generate, we're moving a larger amount of weight, so we can increase our power if we recruit more muscle fibers. All right, so how do we get a sustained contraction? Okay. Well, first of all, we all have a sustained muscle contraction, and that's actually, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here, called muscle tone. You can say, oh, somebody looks really cut or somebody looks really buff. We are all constantly sending electrical signals from our brain to each of our muscles, and they're in some sort of partial sustained contraction. The more signal that's being sent, the more cut or more tone somebody looks. And you can get that by working out or not working out. We either hypertrophy or atrophy. So with this, we can have different types of contractions based on how many motor units we call into play, or what kind of motor units. So smaller motor units, that means smaller in terms of how big is the axon, those ones get recruited first. So that's the example of, we're doing bicep curls with a 5-pound dumbbell. Those smaller ones are going to get recruited first. In a larger motor unit, that means the diameter of the axon is larger. Now we're going to recruit some more motor units. So we're going to recruit the smallest ones first and the bigger ones second. So now we've gone from 5 pounds to 10 pounds, 10 pounds to 20 pounds, maybe 20 pounds to 30 pounds. You're going to recruit more and more muscle units as you're training those muscles. Now keep in mind, even when we're recruiting more, our movements are smooth. They're not herky-jerky, well, unless you get to the point where you're fatiguing, but most movements involved, most types of contractions involve one of two types of muscle contractions. And come on, a little slow there. Two types of muscle contractions, and you've probably worked with both of these. The first one is called an isotonic muscle contraction, where we're changing the shape or changing the length of our muscle. Basically, isotonic means there's some sort of movement involved. So if you're looking right here, that's the isotonic situation. And when you shorten the contraction, the bicep brachii muscle is going through a concentric contraction because the muscle is getting shorter, moving that dumbbell up. Your bicep brachii muscle will also lengthen at time, and that's called an eccentric contraction, where we're increasing that angle. So anytime there's a movement, walking, running, jumping, there's a concentric and an eccentric contraction taking place anytime there's movement. Isometric, the key here with isometric type situations is there is no movement. Okay, the muscle is contracting, but there's no change in length. Maybe that's a situation where somebody's pushing on your head. So here's your head, shoulders. Somebody takes their hand, holds your head in place, and you contract and you're going to try and move it that way, and they don't let you move it. That would be an example of an isometric contraction. The muscle is contracting, but there's no movement taking place. Or maybe when you're trying to push something, okay, trying to push a car, and it's not moving yet, so you need to get a couple more people to help you push the car. Your muscles are contracting, but there's no movement sort of taking place. So that would be our two major types of contraction. And then lastly, there's our muscle types. Fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. We really have two, but we classify one of the two kind of together, so sometimes we break it up into three. First, we have the slow twitch muscle fibers. You may have heard these. Sometimes they're referred to type 1. These are the ones that are oxidative. They go through aerobic processes using oxygen. They're resistant to fatigue. So they're really red. The red means they're going to have a lot of myoglobin in it. Remember, myoglobin holds oxygen, a great blood supply. These ones don't fatigue very easily. They might be like your back muscles and some of the muscles in your legs. And we'll talk about athletes, the two types of athletes here, but typically these are cross-country type runners or long-distance runners that have these slow twitch fibers. Next, we'll talk about the fast twitch muscle fibers. The fast twitch muscle fibers, typically called glycotic fibers or type 2A. So type 2 here as well. The type 2A or the fast twitch glycotic muscle fibers, that'd be like the white type tissue. The muscle fibers appear to be more white because there isn't as much myoglobin. So here the difference would be, this would be what we call dark meat up here if we're eating turkey or chicken, and this would be the white meat down here. Poor blood supply. These get fatigued very easily. Like a lot of the muscles, like say in your chest when you're bench pressing, things like that. And then the last type is one that kind of fast twitch. They have some of the quickness, the speed type twitch, but they're sort of an intermediate. So they will go through glycolysis, but then they are oxidative in nature, so they can replenish their ATP. So they appear a little more pink. They have a little more myoglobin than the type 2A, but they have less myoglobin than the type 2B, and so they're resistant to fatigue. So this is more of an intermediate type situation. And so all of our muscles really have a combination of these. This would be down here, the fast twitch type 2A. This would be more like the sprinter. There we saw the cross country runner, and some of our muscles have some of these intermediate type fibers, the type 2B. So they'll actually do some tests. Some high-end athletes, professional athletes, if they're training for the Olympics, things like that, you can actually perform a test and see what kind of muscle tissue do you mostly have in your legs. Are you going to be a better cross-country runner, or are you going to be a better sprinter? And we can do those tests and put people in situations where they can experience success with those. So that wraps up section 9.4.